evidence. And you can understand that we're only going to see what they want us to see afterwards. But that there was resistance, perfectly reasonable. People in international waters have a right to defend themselves, just as you would from the Somali pirates. But apparently the first group of Israeli commandos was surprised. They did not expect resistance, and as I remarked to someone, they've gotten sufficiently used to slaughtering people who don't fight back,
right.
that they may have been unprepared for some people who did fight back, even no matter how limited and no matter how ill-equipped. So that was a miscalculation, and the Turks are, from what I can tell, genuinely furious, and I found it there was a very interesting meeting just today between Turkey, Iran, and Russia.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and there's a really nice picture of Erdogan and Putin standing there shaking hands and smiling, and I could almost see in Putin's eyes the thought, and now we'll get through the Dardanelles.
Exactly, right. Like they've wanted to do now for about, 400 or 500 years?
Probably a little bit longer. I think from the point that the Russians understood that there was something called the Mediterranean as well as the Black Sea. But this is the sort of thing that, for very different reasons, because of the arrangement on nuclear fuel that Turkey and Brazil worked out with Iran, and that a lot of people thought was pretty good, and the U.S., of course, hated because it would make it more difficult to stage a war with Iran. But Turkey and Iran and Russia have an odd community of interest on this. And if this thing continues and Turkey calls upon NATO for support, particularly if the next round has a Turkish flagship and a Turkish warship, and the Israelis take them on, if NATO is called on and does nothing, Turkey's out of NATO, I would suspect, and the NATO members, many of the NATO members will take another look at their involvement in Afghanistan, which is essentially a NATO response. So there's some interesting games. So the Israelis misunderstood a lot of the dynamics on this. And it's odd that they misunderstood the Turks. The Brits did it at Gallipoli in World War I. People have constantly misunderestimated them and generally found themselves to be unpleasantly surprised in response to it.
Right, and it's not as if they haven't had warning. I mean, for the last year at least, Erdogan has been saying things that, well, let's face it, they have not been said in a long time. And I mean, when he got up and marched out of that meeting in Davos,
with Paris,
exactly. I mean, that should have been a signal to them that that this guy was cut from a different strand of cloth than his predecessors, and that Turkey had just about had enough of Israel and her business, and of course, the whole business with Operation Cast Lead. I mean, there's just only so much blood that people can take, so much bloodshed and human suffering that they can take, and so this should not have been so much a surprise to Israel as it has been. But again, it goes back to this arrogance factor that you talk about, that they really have been blinded. It's like they've got a form of cataracts or glaucoma where they cannot see how they are building this sea of enemies around them. And I don't just mean in the Middle East. I mean all over the world. And it's because it's this willful blindness that, unfortunately, I think is just going to propel them deeper into the same kinds of activities that we saw take place last week.
Well, that's very true. But where they calculated correctly, and it's why they truly don't care, is because the 800-pound gorilla in the global sandbox, the United States, is absolutely under their influence, and the effect of this, the U.S. alone stopped the UN Security Council from imposing sanctions, or certainly from condemning them as the first step. Normally, the initial one is a condemnation and a call for actions to be done, and then sanctions if that doesn't happen. But I mean, the U.S. was clearly prepared to veto that, and so you get pablum from it. I think the general sense of the international community without a U.S. veto or the U.S. weight in it is what happened on the Human Rights Council immediately afterwards when the HRC took up that same issue of the ships. But they have a lock on the American media so complete that the things the Turks and others in the world see that do enrage them are never shown in America. I would guess that 99% of the American people, a minimum of 99% of the American people, do not see the things that appear on British, French, Russian, Turkish, Chinese, Australian newspapers and press. They don't see it. And with that, and with the series of resolutions being prepared and public statements by everyone from Biden through most of the key members of the House and Senate, both houses, both parties, the large, no, I won't say that, the controlling representation of the Israeli spin on everything by all of the networks, all of the major newspapers. I mean, the American people aren't so much fools as they are kept in absolute ignorance of what's happening. So the Israelis were correct that they had that. And when I heard about the Helen Thomas case, I was very intrigued because I thought, the timing of that couldn't have been better.
Sure.
You have someone who had impeccable seniority and credentials, made a comment sometime past about Israel. This was the appropriate time to bring it out. She's destroyed within less than 24 hours. Yes. But the only criticism I have of her is that she shouldn't have apologized. But we all do our things. And as far as I can tell, every principal organization of American journalists, including the White House Press Corps, has supported this and condemned her. I mean, if that's bought, that's bought and paid for. The United States has probably one of the most effective militaries that's come down in the history of the world, and we are a little better than Israeli janissaries.
Yeah, that's right, Israeli janissaries. I predict I'm going to read that in an upcoming Alan Sabrosky article.
There probably will be one of those. But in effect, that's what it is. And so, I mean, they read that very carefully. But, so much of the leadership of the organizations that's been trying to get aid into Gaza or in opposing the lobby, the Israel lobby in the United States, play to that lobby and to Israel's strengths. There have been many good writers on strategy, from Sun Tzu to Liddell Hart and others, who pointed out that an indirect approach is by far the wiser one. And the approach of Viva Palestina and Free Gaza and a lot of the associations in America has been sort of like World War I generals saying, well, one more frontal assault. Why don't we try it? Yes, there's barbed wire and machine guns and gas, but one more frontal assault will do it. Going directly to Israel, either with unarmed ships and people who are unarmed and committed effectively to peaceful resistance, an nonviolent resistance, gives the Israelis the option of doing whatever they want on the land and at sea. Let me tell you a little story here that will illustrate the point.
Okay.
Very, very, very few people who look at politics haven't heard of Mahatma Gandhi and Nehru and the nonviolent resistance to the British Raj. And it worked against the British because there were limits to which the British, even the most callous of their commanders, and they had a few nasty people out there too. Every imperial power has had them. But by and large, I mean, there were limits to which they would not go. One of my great vices, and this is going to be one of those secrets that you can now disclose to the entire world, is that I am absolutely addicted to science fiction. I like science fiction. I like military science fiction, alternative history science fiction. And one of those that I read had, an alternate outcome to World War II. And, Nazi Germany had won it. And a field marshal who was actually a historical figure named Modell was in India to take the surrender of the British forces and to be effectively Governor General of India for the Reich.
Mm-hmm.
And Gandhi and Nehru came to him with essentially the same proposal that they had given the British.
Mm-hmm.
And his reaction, as you may guess from a Nazi field marshal, was not only no, but hell no.
Mm-hmm.
And so they tried exactly the same tactic against him that they had done so successfully against the British.
Mm-hmm.
And to make a long story, it was a very long story, very short, Modell had his troops machine gun Nehru's and Gandhi's followers and put the two of them up against a wall and shot them and then got on with his dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Israel's in that mode.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if